During the 1930s, Winston Churchill languished on the backbenches of the House of Commons as a political outcast. Yet from the standpoint of work, these wilderness years were the most energetic and productive years of his life. While many of the ruling elites were busy disarming Britain and coddling Adolf Hitler, Churchill sounded a jarring alarm. He wrote 11 books and hundreds of articles and delivered dozens of speeches in Parliament. He was a lone voice, crying out in the political wilderness. These are the years that helped to prepare him for Britain's darkest hour.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the program. Back in 1931, Winston Churchill wrote an essay entitled "Moses, the Leader of the People." And in this article, he took issue with people who were at the time saying that Moses was just an allegorical figure, that a lot of the Bible in the Old Testament, it's just in the category of myth. And he took exception with that. Winston Churchill did. He considered Moses to be the Israelites' national hero, and they needed him for all of the perils of the wilderness, as he pointed out in the piece. They needed a national hero to deliver them from captivity, to deliver them through their darkest hour, you could say. Martin Gilbert, the famous historian, he said that Churchill in the 1930s, that was his wilderness years period, because he was a political outcast, and yet, as you'll see from some of the material I cover here today, he really did stay productive. He kept busy. He had a tremendous amount of energy during that period. This is from the essay that Churchill wrote, and he's talking here about Moses. He said, every prophet has to come from civilization, but every prophet has to go into the wilderness. He must have a strong impression of a complex society and all that it has to give, and then he must serve periods of isolation and meditation. This is the process by which psychic dynamite is made. Now you could say Churchill himself produced a little bit of psychic dynamite during the 1930s. During his wilderness years, you'll recall, many of you, that when he did finally become prime minister in May of 1940, he said he went to bed that night, and before he did, he said he felt like he was walking with destiny. He felt like he had been prepared over the long life that he had led, even to that point, that he had been prepared for that moment. And in fact, he was being prepared during those wilderness years, during the 1930s, and he didn't waste away that time just because a lot of people didn't like him. As I said, he kept himself very busy. He took advantage of those wilderness moments that he had before he was then thrust right into the limelight. Before then, all of Britain really did depend upon him and his leadership. Well, let me just take you through Exodus 2, some of these verses. This comes from the biography about Moses. Comes right out of the Bible, and this is what your Bible says about him and what led up to his wilderness period. It says in verse 10, and the child grew and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. This is speaking of the baby, the infant Moses. And she called his name Moses, and she said, because I drew him up out of the water. So here is Moses, a young Moses, because of a trial that his family was put through. He became the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. And so he rose in prominence right there in Pharaoh's household. Verse 11, it says, and it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren, his people, that is, the Israelites, and he looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So he killed the Egyptian and buried him to help his people, to help the Hebrew people. That's what he thought anyway. Verse 13, it says, and when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together, and he said to him that did the wrong, wherefore smite you your fellow? And he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Intend you to kill me, as you killed the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. Now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. He went out into the wilderness, and he sat down by a well. Here he was one of the most powerful men in Egypt, growing up in Pharaoh's house, and he went from that to immediately just being an outcast, a fugitive even. He was a has-been. His career was over. Let's go to the New Testament, the book of Acts. Acts chapter 7 also covers some of this history about Moses. Acts chapter 7, and we'll begin in verse 20. Notice this, it says here, in which time Moses was born and was exceeding fair and nourished up in his father's house 3 months. And when he was cast out, Pharaoh's daughter took him up and nourished him for her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. It says here he was, well, you can look at other translations. The Moffat translation, for example, says that he was a strong man in speech and action, so mighty in word and deeds. And there's other sources like in Josephus that talks about his Egyptian military conquests. So as I say, he was a powerful leader within the Egyptian society before that incident in Exodus 2 that we just read. Verse 23 here in Acts, it says, and when he was a full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. So this brings us to that incident where he killed the Egyptian. It says, and seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him and avenged him that was oppressed and smote the Egyptian, for he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. So this came long before God commissioned him at the burning bush. This was when Moses was younger. He hadn't gone into the wilderness yet. And he just assumed, well, surely the Israelites look upon me as their leader. Surely they see me as someone who will deliver them. He just kind of assumed those things. He just kind of assumed he'd be the big shot leader. Well, the people of Israel didn't look at him that way. Verse 26, it says, and the next day he showed himself unto them as they strove, and would have set them at one again, saying, sirs, you are brethren. Why do you wrong one another? But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, who made you ruler and judge over us? Will you kill me as you did the Egyptian yesterday? And then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons. So he went out into the wilderness, and he was a stranger. He was, you could say, a political outcast at that moment, a complete nobody. Now, the thing that we need to keep in mind here is that God was very much involved in these events. God was orchestrating this because he was, in fact, preparing Moses for a great commission. He was to be a deliverer, but he needed to be prepared for it first. Carrying on in verse 30, it says, and when 40 years were expired, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Eternal in a flame of fire in a bush. So here he is now at the age of 80. He's an old man by this point. 40 years, his youth and upwards to 40 years of age in Egypt. And then for 40 years, he was pretty much alone in the wilderness. Verse 31, it says, and when Moses saw it, he wondered at the sight. And as he drew near to behold it, the voice of the Eternal came to him, saying, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses, it says, trembled and does not behold. So this is a very different Moses after his time in the wilderness, time that he needed. Even Churchill wrote about that in that 1931 article. He needed those wilderness years. He needed to produce a little bit of psychic dynamite. And he did do that. Verse 33, it says, then said the Eternal unto him, put off your shoes, from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. I have seen the affliction of my people, which is in Egypt, and I have heard their groaning, and I am come down to deliver them. And now come, it says, and I will send you into Egypt. So this time around, he hears from God that you're going to be the deliverer. And far from the attitude that he took previous to this, previous to his fleeing into the wilderness, this time he thought, well, I can't do this. He protested. He thought, I'm not up for this kind of a responsibility. He talked about a speech impediment that he had. But the fact is, God took him out into the wilderness, and it really did help to further his education. It certainly humbled him. And he was ready to look to God, and that's what God needed. So he used those wilderness moments the right way. Verse 36, it says, and he brought them out after he had showed wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness 40 years. It says this, verse 38, this is he that was in the church in the wilderness with the angel which spoke to him at Mount Sinai, and with our fathers who received the lively oracles to give unto us. So what a story. That's a little synopsis or summary, I guess, of the whole story of Moses and God using him to deliver the Israelites. Let's look at a few verses in Hebrews chapter 11 here before we cut to our literature promo. We have quite a lot of this history, by the way, is discussed in our literature. Today we're offering the Former Prophets book, which takes you through a lot of Old Testament history. Moses, of course, is just one of many, and these are not allegorical figures. These are individuals like you and me, flesh and blood individuals, so many of them. Moses, Abraham, Joshua, who followed Moses, the Israelites of old, all of this. This is history. And there's valuable lessons in all of this for us, as Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 12, or chapter 10, I think it is. But the Former Prophets book, make sure that if you haven't requested that already, that you call our operators during the break and request your free copy. But this is Hebrews 11 here in verse 24. It says, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So when he became educated in God's ways, and a lot of that required him to unlearn some of the Egyptian ways, then he was ready to serve God, even if it meant forsaking all that he had known and learned growing up in Pharaoh's household. Verse 25 says, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. So Egypt, the Bible teaches, is a type of sin. And when we come out of this world and into the church, we're coming out of sin and into God's family. And we have all of that history before us to show us what we need to do, to show us the approach that we need to take. We need to come out of sin, forsake the ways of sin, claim that sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and then go forward with Christ. Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2, looking to the author and the finisher of our salvation, walking in the steps of Jesus Christ, walking by faith. That's what Moses did. It says that he chose rather to suffer affliction with God's people than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. There is a little bit of pleasure in it, but it only lasts for a season before the kickback happens, cause and effect. Sin brings suffering, ultimately. You can see that by just looking at the world today. Look at how much suffering there is in the world today. It's because of sin. That's the simple answer, but yet mankind won't face up to that. We want to kick and scream against it. We want to fight against God's ways. We want to deal with the effect, not the cause. We don't want to go to the cause of our problems. We just want to try to find the easy out at the end, some kind of a temporary Band-Aid that will take away the pain or give us some relief, whatever it is. One final verse here, verse 26, it says, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. He had his mind on his reward. He used that time in the wilderness to draw closer to God. He took advantage of that time that he had alone with God. And Churchill certainly did the same thing back in the 1930s. Now, he wasn't an especially religious man. He wasn't necessarily drawing near to God, but he certainly was immersed in his own history, his identity, the history of the British people, particularly his famous ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough. He wrote several volumes about his famous ancestor during the 1930s. I'll talk a little bit about that when we come back from the break. But make sure you request the Former Prophets, and also this one. I'll mention this at the end of the program. My father's book, The New Throne of David. We've also got the latest Trumpet issue here. Make sure you subscribe, if you haven't already, to the Trumpet magazine. All of our literature we send out at no cost to you anyway. It's free. The subscription is free. There's no cost or follow-up. Just contact our operators today and request the free literature. We'll be right back. As I mentioned before the break, Winston Churchill, he signed a contract to produce this several volume series about his famous ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough. And he wrote these books between 1933 and 1938. And a lot of what motivated him was he felt like that historians hadn't been fair with the Duke of Marlborough, with John Churchill. So he got into the history and wrote about how he was a great soldier and also a man of great character. And he very proudly immersed himself into that task. This is a quote from Henry Steele Commager's intro to Marlborough, and he's writing about Marlborough and Churchill. It says, like Marlborough, Churchill was called upon to rescue Europe from the grasp of a tyrant, to preside over a prodigious political and military coalition, to sustain allies who faltered and drooped, to fire the spirits of those who were reluctant, to assuage those who thought they contributed more than their share, to persuade the British people to bear over cruel years the blood, toil, tears, and sweat of war. So he was, in a lot of ways, reliving the history of his own famous ancestor. He relived some of that history in the 1940s. His studies, his work, the prodigious amount of work that he put out in the 1930s, it very much helped to prepare him for the monumental challenges that he would face. It shows the importance of our studies, knowing our history, in particular knowing our Bible history, knowing God's truth. This is our rock, this is our foundation, this is the anchor for our soul. God's truth, God's Word. We have a correspondence course, by the way, that will take you right through the Bible, a wonderful 36-lesson course that will open up your understanding to the Bible like never before. And that's what you need. If you have a momentary wilderness years period, and here recently we've all had that to some degree, make the most of it. Use your time wisely. If we are coming under a period where we have to shut things down or we can't travel as much, what an opportunity. What an opportunity that could be for our understanding of God's truth, for our knowledge, for our learning, for coming to understand and know the Holy Bible. It's the most popular book in human history. And yet, how many people really delve into it? How many people really study God's truth? Well, coming back to these two leaders, Churchill and Moses, these were individuals that really did make the most of their wilderness years. And there's a few lessons that I'll just leave you with. Lessons from the wilderness, you could say. The first one here in Deuteronomy 8. This is Deuteronomy 8 and verse 15. It says, this is speaking of God leading Israel, the entire nation, into the wilderness. It says in verse 15, who led you through the great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water, who brought you forth water out of the rock of flint. Verse 16 says, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers knew not, that he might humble you, it says, that he might prove you, to do you good at the latter end. So God took them through the wilderness to humble them. And that's certainly a valuable lesson to remember about the wilderness years. My father's written before about Churchill, how that, when he went into the 1930s as a political outcast, it was really a depressing time for him. Nobody likes to be an outcast. And yet, as my father has said, it was good for him. He kept busy. He worked hard. He produced the Marlborough biography and hundreds of other articles and speeches and such, books even. But it also humbled him, and that was good for him. God was preparing him for that role that he would play right out on center stage, beginning in May of 1940. Remember humility. If you have moments, or maybe if you're going through a wilderness period where there are, as we just read, fiery serpents and scorpions, so to speak, well, take heart. This could be an opportunity for you to really experience some exciting spiritual growth. Notice John chapter 5. This is John 5 in the New Testament. And here's another thing to remember about your time in the wilderness. If you have a time such as that, you have to walk by faith. When you get to the end of that wilderness period, for Churchill, remember he said, I felt like I was walking with destiny. This is what I'm supposed to do. I've been prepared for this. I can take on this challenge. We're going to win this. What a spirit that was for all of the British people. That's what they needed desperately. And God provided that for them in the form of Winston Churchill's leadership. It was the same with Moses. Moses learned some lessons, some valuable lessons in the wilderness, and then he came back and said, well, if this is what you expect me to do, God, I'll do it. But you're going to have to lead me. And he did walk by faith. Jesus set that example for us as well. John 5:19, it says, then answered Jesus and said to them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. For what things soever he does, these also does the Father or the Son likewise. So he just looked at the Father's example and he followed in those steps. Verse 30 says, I can of mine own self do nothing. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just, because I seek not my own will, but the will of the Father, which has sent me. So he sought the Father's will. He followed in those steps. Walk by faith. One final lesson to consider in the wilderness years period that we all have from time to time is that we have to, like Churchill did, and Moses too, thoroughly prepare. Delve into your studies. Prepare your mind for what's ahead. If we think the world is in chaos and turmoil now, wait until these cataclysmic events that are prophesied in your Bible, wait until those are upon us. Now that's something to prepare for. Again, looking at the example of Churchill, this is from Henry Steele Commager. He says, surely this historical investigation, which for 5 years absorbed Churchill's energies, may be looked upon as a providential preparation for the years ahead when he was to stand a greater Marlborough, surveying a greater scene, presiding over a greater battle, commanding a greater coalition, whose destinies were fraught with greater significance. All of that training, all of that preparation, he used that time to prepare for the greater tests and trials ahead. Isaiah 66, quickly, when we think about what is prophesied, as I just mentioned, well, we know the tribulation and the lead up to it, that will finally then give way to the greatest event in the history of the universe. And Isaiah 66:8 says, for it's going to bring forth, the earth, it says, shall be made to bring forth in one day, or shall a nation be born at once? For as soon as Zion travailed, she brought forth her children. The birth of the firstfruits, the birth of God's family. It's going to happen at a sudden instant. It's going to happen overnight, and there will be God's family. That's something we've got to prepare for. Make the most of your wilderness years period. Make the most of this calm before the storm. And really, you can't very well look at this world and say there's much calm, but we don't have much time left, and we have to prepare in earnest for the return of Jesus Christ. This literature, the new throne of David by my father, I didn't have as much time to get into that here at the last, but if you request these books, you can certainly continue your study far beyond what we've been able to get into today. We thank you for joining us on today's show, and we'll see you next time.